A'udhu billahi minash shaitan rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I seek refuge from Satan with Allah. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise and glory is due to God, whose blessings cannot be counted by the counters, whose worth cannot be described by the speakers, and whose homage cannot be adequately paid by the worshippers. None can fully understand him. Reason cannot visualize him. Human faculties of conception, perception, and intuition cannot fathom the extent of his majesty. There was no time when he did not exist, and there will be no duration without his existence. He created the universe with omnipotence, and he knew the details of everything before he brought it into existence. I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the servant and the prophet of God. Almighty God has placed his trust in Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, may the peace of God be upon them. They are the group who protect his commands and his message, and they are the group who expand and spread and explain God's message. So as you're aware, my theme based on the Quranic verse from Surah Azhar, verse number 21, where God says, "You have indeed in the messenger of God, an excellent model for those of you who have hope in God and in the last day, and who frequently engage in the remembrance of God." Most of you will recall we talked about the importance that the Prophet placed on knowledge yesterday. Hopefully that set the scene on the emphasis that Islam places on knowledge, how it's an integral part of the faith as shown by the Quran and the traditions. And yesterday we covered the three things. We covered what knowledge Muslims are expected to acquire, why we are expected to acquire it, and how we can go about acquiring and applying it. So tonight I want to focus on how, following the Quran and the advice of the Prophet, a largely ignorant and uneducated community transformed in a relatively short space of time, a few decades, into a community of knowledgeable individuals. And how, in the initial centuries, gave rise to a flourishing Islamic civilization. We'll then go into the main reasons how it was sustained, and then later how it stagnated and sadly declined. What were the main facets of the civilization, and what factors caused it to decline? Now, the period from the Prophet's death till the tragedy of Karbala was a mixture of territorial expansion of Islamic lands, but also Muslim on Muslim wars and battles, particularly between Muawiyah and Imam Ali alayhi salam. Whilst Muawiyah laid the foundation for dynastic rule, the Umayyad dynasty, the Prophet's family focused on advising Muslims on Quranic laws, on prayers, on supplications. So, for example, we've got a collection of supplications from the fourth Imam, the Sahifa Sajjadiyah, and he's also written a treatise on human rights. But the two Imams that were critical in setting the intellectual part of Islam were Imam Baqir alayhi salam and Imam Jaffer as-Sadiq alayhi salam. They were instrumental in striving for the spread of knowledge and intellectual activity. Both Imams, as we know, had no worldly source of language because they had no teacher as such. So their knowledge was God-given, also known as ilme laduni. Now, one explanation of this knowledge is what I briefly covered before about the subconscious and the conscious mind. So here I want to go into a little bit more detail into that. As we said, the subconscious mind is a treasure house of knowledge from the beginning of the world. And modern science has tended to support this theory. I won't go into a lot of detail, but if people want to come and ask me later, we can discuss that. The explanation is that when someone is appointed as a prophet or an imam, the curtain that hangs between his conscious and his subconscious mind is lifted. And it is also said that there are two layers of the subconscious mind, a primary layer and a final layer. Now, ordinary people like us come into contact with the primary layer. When we fall asleep, we have dreams and so on. That's actually connecting with the primary layer of your subconscious. But the prophets and the imams are in touch with the final layer of the subconscious mind, which holds this knowledge that I talked about. The other explanation of this knowledge is, as explained by Imam Ali in one of his sayings, Ma salli ala Muhammad. Now he is reported to have said that you should know that knowledge which came from the heaven for Adam alayhi salam, and every kind of knowledge which was bestowed on all the prophets of God, including Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Allahumma salli, is with his descendants. And of course we have the famous hadith from the Prophet, I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. So therefore we believe that the prophetic knowledge was transmitted, passed down from the Prophet to the Imams. Now the fifth Imam, Imam Baqir, used to hold classes at the Prophet's mosque in Medina. He initially used to teach history, grammar, literature, and Rijal or Hadith studies. He later introduced geography and astronomy. Among the audience at the mosque was his young son, our future sixth Imam. And he was actually instrumental in extending and expanding the science or the science subjects that were learned further into physics and philosophy. Now, some critics have said that some of that knowledge came from Ptolemy in Egypt or from Greek philosophers. But at the time, it's worth pointing out that none of the books that they had written had been translated into Arabic. Now, there's an interesting piece of research from it's called the Committee of Strasbourg in France, who studied the life of the Imam. And they have actually identified some of the knowledge claims that have been attributable to the Imam. Now these include, and I've touched on a couple of things. The Imam refuted the theory that the sun, the moon, and the planets rotate around the earth back in 1400 years ago. He argued that the earth rotated on its axis, hence we have the day and night, and the sun and the other planets, the sun was stationary and the other planets rotated around the sun. Now Copernicus of Poland came to that conclusion in the 15th century. The Imam also rejected the theory from Aristotle of the universe or the world made up of 4 elements, and he proved that it was wrong. And he remarked, I wonder how a man like Aristotle could say that in the world there are only 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Earth, as we know, is not an element. It's made up of a number of metals, each of which is an element in itself. And for many years, this theory was not refuted and remained the cornerstone of physics. Our Imam also proved that water, air, and fire were also not elements, but a mixture of elements. And he said this hundreds of years before European scientists discovered that air was not an element and separated it into its constituents. Now, more relevant for our time was that the Imam is reported to have said that we should not pollute our environment. Otherwise, it will become increasingly difficult to live on this planet. Now, of course, during his time, there were no factories or cars or any other form of pollution. So clearly, he must have had our times in mind. And of course now, we begin to realize that pollution, if it continues at this level, is going to cause dire consequences. I don't know about the US, but in the UK, we have this principle of polluter pays. So for example, if you drive a big gas guzzling car, you end up paying more tax, particularly company car drivers. And then there is a lot of subsidies on solar panels and so on. I'm not sure whether that applies in the US, because I know you guys have got used to cheap energy, and we can only dream about driving 5-liter cars in the UK, because the pound notes will be coming out of the exhaust. So, as I said, so if the air pollution increases at the current level, there are some predictions that in 50 years, up to 50% of the plankton, the organisms in the ocean that absorb carbon and give out, through photosynthesis, will die out. And that will reduce the capacity of the oceans to act as dumping of carbon. So our sixth Imam gave rise to this intellectual awakening, which was sometimes credited to the Banu Abbas, the dynasty that followed the Umayyads. But most of their rulers, except Al-Ma'mun, were not interested in knowledge, mainly interested in the luxuries of life that they pursued. Now, Imam Jafar alayhi salam had set up an academy of learning in Medina, and it is reported that he directly or indirectly trained up to 12,000 students in the subjects that we talked about. Before the Abbasid al-Mansur closed it down, putting the Imam under house arrest and later poisoning him. One of his famous students, we touched on him yesterday, Jabir ibn Hayyan, died in 803 AD, was commonly known as the father of chemistry. Now, he explored methods of extraction and purification of various compounds, including something called royal acid, which he used to dissolve gold. He also did extensive work, which is still relevant today, on poisons and antidotes. And he wrote an entire book on colored glass and introduced a number of innovations in this industry. So with all these traditions and the Imam's contributions, we begin to, I think, understand why sometimes the Shia sect is referred to as the Jafari sect. So one of the features of the early Islamic civilization was that Muslim intellectuals considered sciences from a single perspective, as branches of a single tree of knowledge. And the goal of all sciences was the discovery of unity and coherence in the world, in the natural world, which demonstrated an omniscient designer and programmer. So in other words, there was always a spiritual dimension to knowledge in Islam, and this connection with the transcendent reality was an important factor. So the source of all knowledge was considered as being one, and intellectuals utilized the experimental and the intuitive approaches for understanding the various levels of existence. A number of scholars of those days, notably Ibn Sina, Umar Khayyam, and Nasiruddin Tusi, and others, combined authority in religious sciences with detailed knowledge of the natural sciences. So there was no separation between the two. By contrast, at that time, learned people in Europe were not even free to express their views. If they said something against the traditions of the Catholic Church, they would be arrested and punished. So the only branch of knowledge that was studied by the Europeans, which was from the East, was medicine. And the first book on this subject was translated into Latin, was the one called Arjoza of Ibn Sina. It was required reading for scholars of medicine in Europe. So whilst this approach to Muslim scholarship, this unified approach of combining religious and natural sciences continued, Muslims led the human civilization in scientific thought, and their cities were centers of learning. Muslim Spain, for example, was a model of scientific progress, tolerance, and pluralism. What I mean by that is that Jews, Christians, Muslims all lived together, feeding off each other, learning from each other, and cooperating with each other. Now, according to George Sorton, who is considered the founder of the discipline of history of science, during the period 750 to 1100 AD, Muslims were the undisputed leaders of the intellectual world. The activity of Muslim scholars was by far superior to any other civilization of the time. It was overwhelmingly superior. And they gave the world many firsts in science, maths, and technology. Even between the 1100 to 1350 AD, the centers of learning in Muslim world retained their global importance. And there are a number of avenues where Islamic science and technology were then transferred to Europe. I want to quote one example to illustrate this point. Southern Spain, or Al-Andalus as it's called, which includes the three big cities of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada. If people have been on a visit there, there is still the relics of Islamic architecture in all those cities. Now that was under Muslim rule from around 711 AD for approximately 700 years. And during this period, the Muslim techniques in agriculture, in irrigation, in hydraulic engineering, in arts and craft, in manufacturing, they were all an integral part of daily life. And the Muslim skills in these fields, once the Christians in the 15th century or late 14th century recaptured Spain, they transferred it from Spain to Italy and then to Northern Europe. And it wasn't just the scientific and the technological ideas, but as Robert Briffault, who wrote a classic book called The Making of Humanity. Now, Robert Briffault was a qualified surgeon who later became a social philosopher and an anthropologist and a writer. So in his book, The Making of Humanity, which I think was originally published in 1919, but has since been republished, and I would again recommend people to read that. There's one paragraph which is so important. I wish more Europeans were aware of this. He says, the ideas of freedom for all human beings, of human brotherhood, of the equality of all men before the law, of democratic government by consultation and universal suffrage, the ideas that inspired the French Revolution and the Declaration of Rights that guided the framing of the American Constitution and inflamed the struggle of freedom in Latin America were not inventions of the West. They find their ultimate inspiration and source in the Holy Quran. Subhanallah. So they are the quintessence of what the intelligentsia of medieval Europe acquired from Islam over a period of centuries. And in another classic work by Professor Philip Hitti, now he's written a very famous book called The History of the Arabs, which was published back in 1938. He was a professor emeritus in Semitic studies at Princeton and Harvard. And he wrote that between the middle of the 8th and the beginning of the 13th century, the Arabic-speaking people were the main bearers of the torch of culture and civilization throughout the world. Moreover, they were the medium through which ancient science and philosophy were recovered, supplemented, and transmitted in such a way as to make possible the Renaissance of Western Europe. So, with those two examples, I think we all begin to realize the contribution of Islamic civilization to the modern world. So now let's turn to what happened that stopped this progress and caused stagnation and then decline. Historians are divided on the causes. Some link it to the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in the 13th century. Others connect it to the 14th century when theological schools started to exclude natural sciences from the curriculum, leaving the Europeans to unravel the hidden laws of nature and to exploit its treasures and resources. But the general consensus seems to be that Islamic civilization has been in decline since the 17th century, and the community of the world of Islam has been under serious assault, both from within and from without. Now, externally, the European powers gradually encroached into Muslim lands, initially under the guise of trade. We have the famous English East India Company, which was founded in 1600. And later, some of the European states started to colonize from the periphery. If you look at the African continent, they took over Algeria, Morocco, and then over time, it changed to direct imperial authority over India and Egypt by the late 19th century. So how did the European countries achieve this? It was through their superiority in the military prowess, in technical technology, organizational and governance matters. So leading one Muslim reformer, Jamaluddin Afghani, to write, "O sons of the East, don't you know that the power of the Westerners and their domination over you came about through their advance in learning and education, and your decline in those domains? Are you satisfied, after your past achievements, to remain in that wretched state into which you were plunged by ignorance and error?" There was also a problem within, lack of unity, which continues even today. Instead of forming a common front versus the foreign colonizers, individual rulers practiced self-preservation at any cost. Sadly, the place where my family comes from, Hyderabad, had a king, the Nizam, who actually joined with the English company to fight against Tipu Sultan, another Muslim ruler from southern India. So a good example of the lack of focus and knowledge and education, if you think about the Mughal rule, which was 181 years in India, not a single university was set up. A number of gardens were set up, a number of memorial buildings were set up, beautiful Taj Mahal was set up, which almost bankrupted the empire, but the focus was not there on education, on knowledge. So now if we fast forward to our current times, there are 1.5 billion Muslims on the planet, 10 million in Europe, 6 million in America. Every fifth human being is a Muslim. For every single Hindu, we have 2 Muslims. For every single Buddhist, we have 2 Muslims as well. And for every single Jew, we have 100 Muslims. So why are Muslims so powerless? So I have a few stats here. Some people said to me yesterday they like stats, so I'm going to give some stats today. So there are 57 member countries in what's known as the Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC. And all of them put together have 500 universities. One university for 3 million Muslims. In the US, apparently, there are 6,000. And what's the population? About 300 odd million. Now, in 2004, the Shanghai University in China compiled a ranking of universities. Not one university from a Muslim country made it to the top 500. Now, as per UN data, the literacy in the Christian world is 90%, and in Muslim majority states, it is 40%. Around 40% of literates in the Christian world attend uni, while no more than 2% from the Muslim world end up going to university. Just as a side, there are apparently 70 million illiterates in the Arab world. So it comes as no surprise that it's so easy to radicalize them, to put them in the wrong direction, because these people don't have any education to fall back on. Muslim countries have 230 scientists per million Muslims. The US has 4,000 per million, and Japan has got 5,000. Furthermore, Muslim countries spend 0.2% of their GDP on research and development, while the Christian world spends 5% on R&D. So the first conclusion is that the Muslim world lacks the capacity to produce knowledge. Another measure of how knowledge is diffused is the number of newspapers per 1,000 people and the number of book titles per million people. So in Pakistan, there are 23 daily newspapers per 1,000 people, apparently. In Singapore, there are 360 newspapers per 1,000. In the UK, the number of book titles per million stands at 2,000. In Egypt, it's 20. So this second conclusion is that the Muslim world is failing to diffuse knowledge. The third aspect is exports of high-tech products as a percentage of total exports. Again, an important indicator of knowledge application. Pakistan's exports of high-tech products as a percentage is 1%. Saudi Arabia, 0.3%. Kuwait, Morocco, and Algeria, same, 0.3. Singapore, 58%. So the third conclusion is that Muslim world is failing to apply knowledge. There is one exception. If we look in the Middle East, Iran apparently has got the highest literacy rate per the UN. For the last 7 years, the figure has been 90 to 98%. And it's got the highest rates of graduation of females. Now, how about Nobel Prize winners among Muslims? Of all these universities, have they actually produced any Nobel Prize winners? Well, actually, the answer is there are two, but there is always a but. One is a gentleman called Ahmad Zewail, who got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1999. His first degree from the University of Alexandria in Egypt, but his Nobel Prize winning work was done at the California Institute of Technology. Then there is Abdus Salam, who won the Nobel Prize in '79 in physics. He did his MA from the Government College University of Punjab, but pursued his scientific work in Italy and the UK. So not quite homegrown Nobel Prize winners. The final bits of stats. Interestingly, the combined GDP of all these Islamic countries, OIC countries, is around 2 trillion. The US on its own produces goods and services 15 trillion and growing. These stats might be a couple of years old. The oil-rich Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar collectively have GDP of 500 billion, mainly oil. Spain alone, a small country, produces 1 trillion of goods and services. So why are we Muslims so powerless? Because we are not producing knowledge, not diffusing knowledge, and not applying knowledge. All because of poor education. And the future, as we know, belongs to knowledge-based societies. And this lack of education has meant that Muslims have had to concede and accept the ways of modernity and secularism, resigning religion to the private sphere. Muslims have become users of technology rather than producers of them. And therefore, to recreate the flourishing Islamic civilization of the past, which included Islamic science, Islamic architecture, Islamic city planning, Islamic medicine, and Islamic economics. What do we need to do? So what do we need to do to bring this renaissance in Islamic education and get back to the forefront of scientific and technological progress? So how can we contribute to the major issues of the day, the problems of the environment, and climate change, on governance, on human rights, on economic issues, on inequality. So the leadership in tackling these issues has been left to others. There are some social reformers and visionaries in the Muslim world. For example, Azhar Abedi, who runs emergency medical services in Pakistan. And then there is Muhammad Yunus, who was the founder of Bangladesh's microfinance institution, the Grameen Bank. But these remain the exception rather than the rule. So coming back to how can we, Muslims in the West, contribute? And in my view, through two avenues. We can educate ourselves in large numbers in science and technology. I talked about this yesterday. And then some of us could go and teach students in Muslim majority countries. Or now with online facilities, we can use online means to imparting this knowledge to other Muslim countries. I know in the US you have got this Khan Academy, which does that on maths. So there's no reason why we can't do that for other subjects. Secondly, as I touched on this before, we can work together, Sunni and Shia, to develop an enlightened version of Islam from the West, rooted in the Quran and the traditions, but outward looking, engaging other faiths, and culturally adapting ourselves to try and replace this negative narrative of the Salafists who want to turn the clock back, who view the West as their enemy. So my time is running on. I'd now like to move to today's Karbala value. We've covered 6 different values, as you know: covenant and responsibility, intolerance to oppression, dignity, infaq, emancipation, and patience. So today's Karbala value is about making enemies in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this value was revived by the Imam, and it relates to inviting calamities, troubles and dangers, and making enemies in the way of God. People fight for their materialistic desires. We're not talking about that. But what the Imam revived was melting one's desires and intentions into the intentions of their Lord. There is a relationship between calamities and virtues. The calamities that befell the Ahl Bayt were the results of the virtues that they possessed. Hence our Imam established a link which states, anyone who possesses virtue cannot escape calamities. If one does not suffer calamities, big or small, at some time in their life, then it is likely that there were few virtues present in that person. So one should tolerate calamities for the sake of virtues given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thus the Imam did not complain. Instead, he expressed his gratefulness while suffering some of the severe sufferings that he went through. And so did Bibi Zainab when she was questioned by Yazid as to how she felt about the entire event of Karbala. She didn't complain. In fact, she said she was grateful. So brothers and sisters, it's the 7th of Muharram today, when water was stopped in Karbala. Tonight, we will lament for Hazrat Abbas, the standard bearer of the Imam's small army. At the Battle of Karbala, Hazrat Abbas and 3 brothers from his mother's side, Abdullah, Jafar, and Usman, fought on the Imam's behalf. When the children of Imam Hussein and Imam Hassan had been killed, Hazrat Abbas said to his brothers, "My brothers, go forward so that I may see that you have remained true to God and His Messenger, for you have no children to defend." They did so and fought fiercely until they were all martyred. Humayd ibn Muslim, the Umayyad historian and reporter who witnessed Ashura, says, when Hazrat Abbas was preparing to mount his horse, for the final time, the curtains of all the tents were raised up, and the honorable ladies came out calling, Ya Ali, Ya Ali. With folded hands, Abbas was begging each lady to go back to their tents. The women were exclaiming, What is there to seek security of tents? The time has come for the looting by the enemies and our imprisonment. The last exchange between Hazrat Abbas and Sister Zainab is particularly poignant. When Hazrat Abbas went to seek her permission, Lady Zainab says that I always used to believe that with a brave brother like Abbas to protect me, who will dare disrespect me or take away my hijab? But now that you are going forward to the battlefield from which no one has returned alive, I realize that those days have come to an end, and we will be at the mercy of our enemies without your loving protection. Hazrat Abbas set out on a mission to fetch some water for Bibi Sakina and the other children in the tents. He fought his way successfully to the banks of the rivulet. The reason there's the Euphrates, I mean, people who've been to Karbala know that the Euphrates is some way off, but there was a small rivulet which was nearer the battlefield. He jumped down from the horse, filled the water bag, and set off back towards the tents. The enemies he had dispersed in getting to the water, when they saw him returning towards the camp, turned out and started to attack him. Seeing that a frontal attack on a man so brave was not possible, they resorted to a barrage of arrows. Hazrat Abbas was trying to protect the bag from the arrows by hugging it to his chest, when one enemy soldier rushed out and dealt a blow to his right hand and cut it off. Now that he was crippled and losing blood, his enemies began to surround him. Another blow from an enemy sword severed his left arm. The odds were mounting against him, and one arrow hit its target, the water bag, and Hazrat Abbas soon lost the water. Seeing his helpless condition, one of the surrounding enemies got close and struck a mortal blow with an iron mace. He reeled over and fell from the horse. He felt life was ebbing away, but wanted to see his brother for one last time. With one last effort, he called out, Mawla, come to me before I die. Our Imam rushed to the spot. Hazrat Abbas heard his voice. Abbas, my brother, what have they done to you? Lanatullahi, Qawmuz Zalimeen.
Muhammad Ali Muhammad Salawat.